Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when wine was served from gilded craters, kings declared their love with spears and blood, and the concept of personal space had yet to be invented. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe take a slow breath in, and let it go. Because tonight, we're gliding softly through the strange, sticky world of ancient Macedonian royalty, where every banquet was a test of loyalty, and every friend might be a future assassin. Just a small, quiet thing. If you like drifting off to strange corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. Quietly, of course. It helps the channel, and it tells me you'd like more sleepy stories like this one. But for now, just relax. Now, when we think of Macedonia, most of us picture Alexander the Great, the golden-haired conqueror, astride his horse Bucephalus, looking like he was auditioning for the cover of a myth. But before we get to him, let's gently rewind a little. Because Alexander didn't come from nowhere. He was the product of a dynasty that thrived on chaos, ambition, and family therapy that usually involved poison. Let's start with his father, King Philip II. A man who could charm an army, seduce an ally, and lose an eye in the same week. Philip was, in many ways, the prototype of the brilliant but exhausting ancient ruler. His idea of diplomacy was to marry every princess within marching distance, and then some. By the end of his life, he had at least 7 wives, possibly more depending on how you count ceremonial unions, and she was there, so why not? Each of these marriages was supposed to secure political alliances. Instead, they mostly secured awkward dinners and a lot of people named Alexander fighting over inheritance. Now, Macedonian banquets weren't just about food and wine. They were public performances of power, places where men toasted the gods, wept over dead comrades, and occasionally tried to stab each other with the nearest skewer. These events were heavy on emotion, light on boundaries, and often ended with at least one guest being declared a traitor before dessert. Philip himself hosted these gatherings with gusto. He'd drink with his soldiers, slap them on the back, call them brothers, and then, if necessary, order their execution the next morning. It was all very, emotionally mixed. At one particularly famous banquet, Philip decided to celebrate his latest marriage, this time to a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. No, not that Cleopatra, this one was a local model. The problem was, his first wife, Olympias, was still very much alive and not known for her calm temperament. Olympias was from Epirus, a region famous for its snakes, its mountains, and its deeply intense women. She reportedly slept with serpents in her bed as part of a religious ritual, which may or may not have been an early warning sign for Philip. Anyway, during the feast, Cleopatra's uncle decided to toast to the hope that Philip's new marriage would finally give him a legitimate heir. Which, of course, implied that Alexander, Philip's son by Olympias, was somehow illegitimate. Alexander, who was sitting right there, calmly threw his cup of wine at the man's face. A classic dinner move. Then Philip, drunk and furious, tried to draw his sword to attack his son, only to trip over his own feet and collapse in front of everyone. Alexander reportedly stared down at his father and said, in what must have been the most awkward silence in ancient history, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." And with that, the party mood died. This, by the way, was a pretty typical Macedonian evening. Affection, alcohol, and a thinly veiled threat of civil war. Now, these banquets were also places where the Macedonians practiced something they called xenia, the sacred bond of hospitality and brotherhood. But in practice, it was less about mutual respect and more about how long you could pretend to trust someone before the knives came out. When Alexander eventually became king, he elevated these feasts into full-blown rituals of loyalty. He'd invite his generals to recline beside him, pour libations to the gods, and then, in moments of drunken camaraderie, make grand declarations like, "We are one people, or you are my brother." It was touching, in a slightly terrifying way. One of the more infamous examples came at the banquet honoring his victory in India. The atmosphere was thick with incense and tension. Wine flowed, music played, and the air was warm with celebration and paranoia. Because by this point, Alexander's closest companions had been together for years. They'd marched across deserts, conquered cities, and buried friends. But they were also exhausted, homesick, and quietly wondering if their golden-haired leader might, perhaps, be losing it. That night, Alexander decided to perform a Persian-style ceremony of proskynesis, the act of bowing or even kneeling before the king as if he were divine. This did not go over well with his Macedonian officers, who had been raised to think of themselves as free men, not courtiers. They were fine with drinking until dawn. They were less fine with being told to worship their drinking buddy. One officer, a man named Cleopatra the Black, had known Alexander since childhood. He'd saved his life in battle. He'd eaten beside him, bled beside him, and probably endured years of his overconfident monologues. But at this banquet, the old camaraderie snapped. Cleopatra, perhaps emboldened by a few too many cups of wine, began loudly criticizing the king, pointing out that Alexander owed his success to his father, to his generals, to men like him. Alexander did not take this well. Words turned to shouting, shouting turned to shoving, and before anyone could intervene, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed Cleopatra on the spot. It was, by all accounts, an accident of pride and alcohol, one of history's most tragic cases of things escalating at dinner. Afterward, Alexander reportedly broke down in grief, refusing to eat or sleep for days. He'd killed his friend, his brother-in-arms, in a drunken rage. And in a way, it was the final unmasking of what those Macedonian banquets had always been, performances of loyalty built on the quiet knowledge that loyalty could vanish in a heartbeat. But even after this, Alexander continued the ritual of the feast. Perhaps because he couldn't stop. The banquets were where he felt most alive, surrounded by laughter, music, and danger. Let's drift back for a moment and look at the culture that produced this peculiar obsession with feasting. Macedonia, unlike the refined city-states of Greece, was a rugged frontier kingdom. The men were hunters, riders, warriors. Their nobility wasn't based on poetry or philosophy but on personal valor and the ability to hold one's liquor. At a Macedonian banquet, how you drank said as much about your status as how you fought. Philip II had actually used these gatherings as political tools, blending genuine camaraderie with strategic manipulation. He'd sit with his generals, share food, promise rewards, and in between toasts, gauge who looked uncomfortable. It was part surveillance, part therapy, and part drinking competition. And his son, Alexander, learned it all by watching him. But where Philip's banquets had been grounded in moral politics, Alexander's feasts drifted toward the divine. The more he conquered, the more he began to see himself as touched by the gods, a kind of living myth. He styled himself after Achilles, whom he idolized, and even brought the Iliad with him on campaign like an emotional support scroll. During his campaigns in Asia, he began inviting Persian nobles to his tables, blending their customs with his own. He adopted elements of Persian court ceremony, dressed in their robes, and encouraged cross-cultural marriages. His soldiers grumbled, of course. They missed the old days, the simpler banquets of roasted meat, crude jokes, and the occasional friendly wrestling match. But Alexander was chasing something larger. He imagined an empire united by shared rituals, by these very feasts. Each time, the same pattern unfolded: wine, flattery, poetry, tension. Sometimes they'd end with tears and embraces. Other times, with blood on the floor. And that, perhaps, was the essence of Macedonian royal life, that fine, shimmering line between brotherhood and betrayal. We'll drift a little further into that world next, exploring how these rituals of loyalty and excess shaped the fate of Alexander's empire long after his cup was empty. Because, as it turns out, when your entire political system revolves around who's sitting next to you at dinner, things can get complicated. Hey everyone! If you're still with me, that means you've either found this story relaxing, or you're too comfortable to move, both perfect outcomes. Let's drift quietly onward. The torches from Alexander's banquets have burned out now. The golden cups are overturned. The music has faded. And all that's left is the uneasy silence of an empire without its king. Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, probably in Babylon, though historians still can't agree on exactly how. Fever, poison, malaria, bad wine, divine retribution, pick your favorite theory. Whatever it was, the most powerful man in the world was gone before he turned 33. He left behind no clear heir, only a pregnant wife and a very confused army. And, in classic royal fashion, he had made zero effort to write down what should happen next. Because of course he hadn't. When his generals gathered in Babylon to decide who would take over, they faced a simple question with no good answers. Who, exactly, could replace a man who thought he was half god? The answer, naturally, was no one. But that didn't stop them from trying. There's a lovely, chaotic energy to this moment, the morning after the world's longest banquet, when the hangover sets in and everyone starts arguing over who gets the last slice of empire. These men were the Diadochi, the successors. They'd marched beside Alexander across deserts and mountains, shared his feasts, his glory, and probably several awkward silences. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses all too well. And now, without the golden boy to unite them, the knives came out, figuratively at first, and then quite literally. Let's float through their ranks for a moment. There was Perdiccas, Alexander's right-hand man, tall, ambitious, and convinced that he could keep the empire together. Spoiler, he could not. There was Ptolemy, the calm, calculating one, who realized almost immediately that the empire was doomed to split and decided to grab Egypt before anyone else noticed. He would later start a dynasty that ended, generations later, with Cleopatra, that Cleopatra this time. Then there was Seleucus, practical and patient, who would quietly pick up the pieces in Asia. Antigonus, the grizzled veteran with one eye and no patience for nonsense. And Lysimachus, who managed to survive mostly by staying out of arm's reach of everyone else. The problem wasn't just that they all wanted power. It was that they were still acting like they were at one of Alexander's feasts, making toasts to loyalty while secretly planning each other's deaths. Perdiccas initially tried to hold the empire together by claiming to rule in the name of Alexander's unborn child. It was a clever idea, it gave him authority without actually being king. But in practice, it just made him the most obvious target for everyone else's paranoia. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Ptolemy, in Egypt, decided to steal Alexander's body, yes, literally steal it, as a political prop. The king's corpse was being transported to Macedonia, but Ptolemy intercepted it and brought it to Egypt instead, giving himself both a holy relic and an excuse to host endless memorial feasts. It's hard to overstate how morbidly brilliant that was. Whoever possessed Alexander's remains possessed his symbolic power. People came from all over to honor the tomb, and Ptolemy quietly transformed it into the heart of a new kingdom. Meanwhile, Perdiccas fumed. He marched toward Egypt to punish this treachery, but, in an impressively self-destructive move, managed to alienate most of his own army along the way. He was assassinated by his officers during a river crossing, possibly between one toast and another. The empire, barely a year old, was already dissolving into feasting, plotting, and mutual loathing. Let's take a gentle moment to appreciate how inevitable this was. The Macedonian court had always revolved around personal loyalty, not institutions, not constitutions, Just a series of men sitting in a room, promising eternal friendship until someone reached for a sword. When Alexander was alive, his charisma and his sheer ability to win battles had kept those egos in check. But once he was gone, the same competitive energy that had conquered the world now turned inward. Each of the generals threw their own banquets now, their own performances of authority. Ptolemy in Egypt hosted serene, sunlit feasts along the Nile. Seleucus dined in the shadow of Babylonian ziggurats. Antigonus threw brutal, military-style gatherings in Anatolia. Each man toasting his own myth, each pretending the empire wasn't crumbling. There's something almost tender in that, this desperate reenactment of a lost world. They couldn't stop pretending they were still part of Alexander's inner circle, still the chosen companions of the divine king. But beneath the wine and ceremony, paranoia simmered. Letters were exchanged, envoys sent, alliances made, and broken faster than a cup could be refilled. Every banquet was a potential death trap. One wrong word, one raised eyebrow, and the next morning your body might be found in the garden, very much not invited to the next feast. As the years drifted on, these generals began carving the empire into recognizable chunks: Egypt, Syria, Macedon, Thrace. The dream of unity faded into regional dynasties, each convinced that they were the true heirs of Alexander. Ptolemy's descendants became scholars and pharaohs. Seleucus's line ruled vast, patchwork lands across Asia. And back in Macedonia, new kings rose and fell with alarming frequency, each claiming divine favor, each presiding over banquets that echoed, faintly, with the ghost of their old master. What's interesting, in a soft, slightly tragic way, is how much of Alexander's style survived even when his empire didn't. The feasts continued. The rituals of brotherhood continued. Even the fashion for calling oneself great or divine caught on like a contagious delusion. There's a painting from centuries later showing Hellenistic kings reclining at a feast, holding up their cups. They wear the same half-smile, proud, weary, trying too hard. It's the face of men who once believed they were part of something eternal, only to realize that eternity is shorter than expected. And yet, even as their kingdoms shrank, the ritual remained. Because power, especially royal power, has always needed ceremony to disguise its fragility. The feast, the crown, the shared cup, all small, shining illusions to keep reality at bay. If you close your eyes now, you can almost imagine it: the clinking of bronze, the murmur of voices, the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. The flicker of torchlight across gold. And in the corner, someone smiling just a little too politely, wondering if the toast he's about to drink might be his last. It's strange, isn't it, how even in collapse, humans cling to the forms of glory. Alexander's empire died, but the feeling of his banquets lived on, that intoxicating mix of friendship and danger, of divinity and decay. And it would echo again, centuries later, in the courts of Rome. Because Rome, ever the magpie of civilizations, stole almost everything from Greece and Macedonia: their gods, their art, their architecture. And, naturally, their taste for spectacularly awkward dinner parties. Let's drift toward that world next, a world of marble villas, reclining senators, and emperors who made the Macedonian feasts look positively wholesome. Hey everyone! Welcome back. If your eyes are starting to feel heavy, that's all right. Just let them. The Romans, after all, built an entire civilization on excess, and then fell asleep in it. So it's perfectly fitting that we drift into their world slowly, like the drowsy aftermath of too much wine and roasted peacock. The Romans were, in many ways, the spiritual heirs of Alexander's Macedonians, but with more marble, more money, and far less self-awareness. They loved the pageantry of power. The feasts, the togas, the gold-leafed everything. And they loved to pretend that every meal was a solemn ritual, even when it was clearly just an excuse to show off and gossip. To the Romans, dining wasn't just eating. It was theater. A carefully choreographed performance where every recline, every sip, every too loud laugh was part of the act. The table was the empire in miniature, a place to demonstrate who was above whom, both socially and literally, since the seating order was based on rank. And nowhere did this performance reach such dizzying heights, or such depths, as in the imperial palace. Let's ease in with one of the more famous practitioners of what we might call culinary autocracy, Emperor Nero. Nero was, in his early days, a promising enough young man. He had tutors, taste, and a flair for poetry. But the problem with being told from birth that you're a living god is that eventually you start believing it, and then start trying to cook like one. His banquets were legendary. Imagine dining rooms with ceilings that rained flower petals and perfumes. Imagine couches of silver, tables of ivory, dishes plated in gold. Guests were expected not just to eat, but to admire. Food was no longer sustenance, it was propaganda. Peacock brains, flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with honey and herbs. The goal wasn't flavor. It was shock. The ancient equivalent of a celebrity chef who sets fire to the meal for applause. One ancient writer claimed Nero once hosted a feast that lasted from noon until dawn, with musicians performing in between courses so guests wouldn't accidentally stop being impressed. The servants were ordered to refill cups before they were even half empty, creating a soft haze of intoxication that blurred the line between pleasure and despair. And in the center of it all, Nero, dressed in shimmering silk, singing his own compositions, perhaps believing the applause was genuine. The Romans, like the Macedonians before them, used the banquet as a political weapon. To eat with the emperor was a privilege, to refuse was an act of defiance. And more than a few senators found that a polite no thank you was swiftly followed by exile, or worse, dessert with hemlock. There's something almost touching about Nero's need to be loved and feared at the same time. He wanted loyalty, but he also wanted applause. So he mixed the two, like wine and poison. Of course, Nero wasn't the first Roman emperor to use the dinner table as a stage. Let's drift back a few decades, to Emperor Claudius. Claudius was an odd man, by all accounts, shy, stuttering, fond of books, and accidentally crowned after everyone else in the royal family had been murdered. The kind of person who'd rather read about history than make it. Which, naturally, made him the perfect candidate to rule Rome. His banquets were less glamorous than Nero's but just as peculiar. Claudius loved to eat. To an almost heroic degree. He was known to fall asleep mid-meal, only to wake and start again, a kind of culinary persistence that even modern buffet-goers would respect. But behind these sleepy dinners lurked darker plots. His ambitious wife, Agrippina, once used a banquet to try to kill him with poisoned mushrooms. Which worked, eventually, though not quite as efficiently as she hoped. The poison only half did the job, so Claudius had to be finished off by a more direct method, a feather dipped in more poison, tickled down his throat. A strangely gentle end for a Roman emperor. You can almost picture it, the golden plates, the flickering lamplight, the scent of roasted meats, and one anxious servant quietly preparing the special course. Agrippina, for her part, sat through the evening like a consummate actress, calm, composed, pretending nothing was amiss. She'd learned, perhaps, from watching men like Nero and Claudius that in Rome, power was never about swords or armies. It was about dinner invitations. Who ate, who served, and who didn't get up afterward. It's funny how many turning points in Roman history happened around a table. Take the Emperor Commodus, for example, the one who thought he was Hercules reincarnated. His feasts were less about food and more about him, which, to be fair, was true of everything Commodus ever did. He liked to appear half-dressed in lion skins, carrying a club, while servants brought in live ostriches or panthers for entertainment. At one particularly disturbing feast, he reportedly beheaded an ostrich in front of his guests, waved the bloody head around, and made a vague joke about senators losing theirs next. The laughter that followed was, you can imagine, very careful. Then there was Caligula, the original showman of imperial excess. He took the concept of banquet as intimidation to an art form. Caligula loved to eat surrounded by the very people he planned to execute, a sort of pre-funeral party, where the main course was fear. He once invited a senator and his wife to dine with him, spent the evening complimenting them, and then casually ordered the senator's death mid-meal. He then continued eating. The wife fainted, was revived, and, since she was there anyway, was told she'd be joining Caligula in bed after dessert. And through it all, Caligula smiled that serene, self-satisfied smile of a man who had confused cruelty for charm. The Romans even had a word for this kind of calculated performance of generosity, convivium, meaning living together. But for the elites, it was less about togetherness and more about control. Who reclined where, who received which dish, who was offered the first toast, these small details could elevate or destroy careers. If you've ever been to a dinner where everyone's pretending to enjoy themselves while secretly plotting against each other, congratulations, you've experienced a Roman banquet, minus the flamingo tongues. By the late Empire, the feasts had grown even stranger. Emperors like Elagabalus turned them into surreal theater. He'd serve hundreds of dishes in a single night, decorate the floors with rose petals so thick that guests sometimes suffocated, and release exotic animals into the dining hall mid-meal, because apparently, dinner wasn't dinner until a leopard wandered past your plate. One of his favorite amusements was serving food dyed entirely one color, a banquet of all purple dishes, for instance. It sounds ridiculous, but in a way, it's almost poetic. When everything around you is crumbling, sometimes the only thing left to control is the color of your dinner. There's a strange, drowsy melancholy to all of it. These feasts were more than decadence. They were coping mechanisms, desperate attempts to hold on to a sense of grandeur as the empire slowly decayed beneath the weight of its own success. Because even in Rome's twilight, as the marble cracked and the treasury emptied, the banquets continued. The gold goblets stayed polished. The musicians kept playing. The guests kept pretending that everything was fine. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden under all the peacock feathers and poison mushrooms, that power, at its core, is a performance. And like all performances, it goes on long after the audience has stopped believing it. So, as the lamps dim in some Roman dining room 2,000 years ago, and the emperor reclines among half-sleeping courtiers, we can almost hear the soft clink of a final toast, to empire, to eternity, to nothing at all. Let's drift now from Rome's endless dinner table toward the cold, candlelit halls of medieval Europe, where kings and queens would inherit not just crowns, but the same hunger for spectacle, and the same talent for ruining dinner. Hey everyone! Welcome back. If you've made it this far, you're either deeply committed to history, or already half asleep. Either way, perfect. Tonight, we're leaving behind the marble decadence of Rome and wandering softly into the candlelit gloom of medieval Europe, a world that smelled faintly of incense, smoke, and whatever had been rotting in the moat that week. This was an age when kings still liked to think of themselves as gods, but with considerably worse table manners. The feasts were smaller, colder, and somehow even more dramatic. Gone were the golden peacocks and rose petals. In their place came trenchers of meat, goblets of wine thick as syrup, and entire courts built on resentment and indigestion. Let's start gently, in England, around the 12th century, with a man who could never quite decide whether he was running a kingdom or a particularly chaotic family reunion, King Henry II. Henry was clever, fiery-tempered, and famously impatient. He ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but his greatest challenge, as it turned out, was dinner with his own family. His 4 sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John spent most of their lives alternately rebelling against him and demanding allowances. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner where all 4 children show up wearing armor. Feasts in Henry's court were tense affairs. The food was lavish: roasted boar, sweetmeats, wine by the barrel, but the atmosphere was one long, simmering argument about inheritance. At any given moment, someone was accusing someone else of treachery, or seducing someone's mistress, or conspiring with the French. Usually all 3. The worst of it came after the family famously turned on one another in open war. Henry, exhausted and betrayed, died in 1189. His body was laid out for burial, his crown slipping crookedly, and, in a final insult, his rebellious son Richard was the one who took the throne. Richard, who would become known as the Lionheart, was brave, glamorous, and almost never home. He spent most of his reign on crusade or in captivity, leaving England to his brother John, who was, by most accounts, a sulky man with a nervous laugh and a talent for making enemies. At John's court, feasts turned into displays of insecurity. He surrounded himself with flatterers who told him how magnificent he was while carefully avoiding eye contact with the kitchen staff, who were probably plotting something. He once held an enormous banquet to celebrate a minor victory in France, only for his guests to discover the food was half-rotten and the wine watered down. It was a fitting metaphor for his reign: all show, no substance. By the time John lost most of his lands and was forced to sign the Magna Carta, his royal banquets had turned gloomy. Chroniclers wrote that the king grew paranoid, obsessed with poisoning, and often refused to eat at all unless he had prepared the food himself. In the end, it didn't help. He died in 1216, reportedly after eating a suspicious amount of peaches and cider, which, in medieval terms, probably meant food that was trying to kill him. Let's drift across the channel now, to France, where the royal table was somehow even more theatrical. The Capetian kings loved ceremony. Their feasts were public events, attended by nobles, bishops, and whatever unfortunate troubadour had been dragged in for entertainment. The table itself was arranged like a social map, the king at the center, the high nobles flanking him, and progressively lesser mortals fanning outward like ripples in a pond. But beneath the glittering surface, the French monarchy was riddled with insecurity and scandal. Take King Philip IV, the Fair. He was tall, elegant, and about as emotionally warm as a frozen cathedral. His court was famously severe, his banquets quiet, formal, and slightly terrifying. Philip's version of a good evening involved silent courses of fish, followed by the discreet trial of someone who had annoyed him that week. He looked like a saint in his portraits, all delicate features and golden hair, though one chronicler noted that he never smiled, except when someone was ruined. Charming man. Then there was his son, Charles IV, who inherited both his father's looks and his complete lack of humor. During one particularly solemn feast, a noble accidentally spilled wine on the royal tablecloth, a minor accident easily forgiven in most places. Charles had the man executed. It's remarkable how little it took to turn a medieval dinner into a public tragedy. But not all royal feasts were grim. Some were simply absurd. Let's float northward for a moment, to Burgundy, land of wine, wealth, and theatrical pageantry. The Burgundian dukes were among the greatest showmen of the late Middle Ages. They hosted feasts that were part religious ritual, part costume party, part fever dream. The most famous of these was the Feast of the Pheasant, held in 1454 by Duke Philip the Good. The purpose was to rally Europe for another crusade, but the event quickly spiraled into an extravagant display of edible symbolism. There were mechanical animals that breathed fire. There were sugar sculptures of castles, mountains, and saints. There were knights dressed as angels, priests dressed as knights, and one dish that reportedly contained a live man hidden inside a pastry. At one point, a massive roast swan was carried in wearing a golden crown, a visual metaphor so heavy-handed it probably required 2 servants. Guests were expected to swear vows of piety before cutting into their dinner, which feels like a very medieval way to ruin everyone's appetite. It's tempting to laugh at all this pageantry, but it's also oddly poignant. These lavish banquets came at a time when Europe was reeling from famine, war, and plague. Outside the castle walls, life was short and hungry. Inside, the powerful were performing an elaborate play, pretending that beauty and faith could still hold the world together. And maybe, for a few candlelit hours, it worked. Let's drift a little further east, to the court of Hungary, under King Matthias Corvinus, one of the few rulers of the era who combined genuine intellect with a love for absurd excess. Matthias prided himself on his knowledge of classical history. He collected manuscripts, studied philosophy, and saw himself as a modern Alexander. His banquets reflected that, featuring not just food, but readings from Aristotle and Plato between courses. Imagine trying to eat roast goose while someone lectures about metaphysics. He also liked to disguise himself and wander among his guests, listening to gossip, then dramatically reveal his identity at the end, a trick that seems amusing until you remember that he was an absolute monarch and could ruin your life on the spot. In one recorded instance, Matthias arranged an entire feast where every dish was dyed blue, to symbolize heaven, he said. The guests smiled politely and tried not to think about how unnatural the food looked. It's clear that by the late Middle Ages, the royal banquet had become a stage play of power. Every detail, from the seating plan to the menu, reinforced hierarchy. Bread wasn't just bread, it was a statement about who got to eat it. And in a way, that's the thread running through all these centuries of feasting, from Macedon to Rome to Burgundy. The same obsession with control, dressed up as hospitality. The same fragile egos, pretending to be divine. But the medievals added one more twist: religion. Every toast, every bite, every song had to acknowledge the Almighty, even if the Almighty might have preferred everyone just go home and get some sleep. As the candles burned lower, the guests would murmur prayers, the musicians would fade out, and the king, weary, stuffed, and half-dreaming, would gaze across his silent hall, wondering who would betray him next. Because in the end, the medieval feast wasn't just about food or faith. It was about survival, social, political, sometimes literal. A careful dance of appearances, performed nightly under flickering candlelight, as Europe stumbled toward the dawn of the Renaissance. And that's where we'll drift next, into the glittering courts of the early modern kings, where the art of the banquet became something even stranger, elegant, refined, and quietly unhinged. Let's drift back into the warm, flickering light of the Macedonian hall. The wine is low now, the torches are dying, and the once joyful roar of laughter has turned into the soft hum of half-sung songs and hiccups. Alexander, ever the restless soul, doesn't notice the hour, or perhaps, he notices it all too much. He has been drinking with his companions for 2 days straight, because of course he has. In one of those grand, tragic gestures that only men certain of their own immortality can make, Alexander decides that the night must not end without one final toast, to Hephaestion. He raises his cup, looks into the middle distance, and murmurs something about eternal friendship, or glory, or how the gods themselves must envy what they had. The room falls quiet. Even the drunkest officers lower their eyes. They all know that Hephaestion is gone, burned with honors fit for a god, and yet Alexander has never quite stopped talking to him. A court scribe later wrote that Alexander seemed possessed by longing, which, in ancient Greek terms, is a polite way of saying he was a man quietly falling apart in public. He ordered everyone to drink, deeply, until they couldn't feel the sorrow, or anything else. Because if there's one thing this story has taught us, it's that Macedonians believed grief could be solved by alcohol and shouting. But this night will not end with cheers. It will end, as many Macedonian banquets did, with silence. Somewhere between one toast and the next, Alexander begins to sweat. He waves it off, heat, maybe, or too much wine. Then his voice starts to slur, and his head droops. The generals exchange uneasy glances. Someone suggests sleep. But Alexander insists he's fine. He's the son of Zeus, after all. And it's very hard to be mortal when you've been told your whole life that you're divine. Over the next few days, he grows weaker. He can no longer rise from bed. He tries to speak to his men, but his voice is gone. And so, in that great palace of Babylon, surrounded by worried servants and despairing generals, the man who once conquered the known world loses the one battle he can't win, against his own body. When his men come to see him, they say he could only nod. They filed past his bed in silence, each one kissing his hand, his cloak, his hair. They were hardened soldiers, but many wept, because no one believed this was how Alexander's story was supposed to end, stripped of his strength, unable to lift a cup or a sword. He had built an empire, and it was dissolving before he could even say goodbye. Of course, the rumors started before his body was cold. Some said he'd been poisoned. Others said it was malaria, or typhoid, or simply the accumulated strain of being Alexander the Great, because it takes a lot out of a person to believe you're a god. His body, they say, didn't decay for days after his death. And to the Macedonians, that was proof enough. Their king must truly have been divine. But really, it was just the desert air and good embalming. History rarely agrees with miracles. When the news spread, the empire fractured almost instantly. The generals began to circle, each one imagining himself the rightful heir to glory. The famous line, "To the strongest," may have been Alexander's dying wish, or it may have been something a poet added later, because it sounded appropriately tragic. Either way, it worked. They tore his empire to pieces in the name of strength. Hephaestion was gone. Alexander was gone. The Brotherhood had become a memory soaked in wine and regret. The great Macedonian experiment, this strange blend of Greek idealism and Persian ritual, had burned brightly and briefly, like a torch left too close to the draperies. But in their ruins, they left stories. And the stories, well, those never die. We can almost see it, if we close our eyes. The banquet hall, the golden cups, the laughter echoing through marble corridors. Hephaestion at Alexander's side, leaning in to whisper something that makes the king smile. For one perfect moment, before the war, before the grief, before the fall. They are simply two young men, drunk on wine and destiny, believing the world belongs to them. And maybe, for a little while, it did. Let's drift away now. The torches have gone out. The empire has gone quiet. All that remains is the faint shimmer of gold leaf and the soft hum of legend. Because in the end, even the greatest of conquerors are just stories we tell in the dark. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, first of all, congratulations. You've survived a Macedonian banquet and the death of a demigod. Now, we drift into something a little colder, and somehow even more absurd. Because nothing says imperial legacy quite like a group of drunk, scheming generals arguing over who gets custody of a corpse. When Alexander died in Babylon, his body immediately became the most important political object in the world. Not his crown, not his throne, not even his empire, just his very expensive, very dead self. In the ancient world, possessing a king's body meant possessing legitimacy. And everyone wanted legitimacy, preferably embalmed and wrapped in gold. At first, there was panic. Who would succeed him? He had no adult heir. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, and as anyone in the royal court could tell you, that's not a particularly secure political position when everyone else in the room has a sword and an ego. The generals gathered, probably still hungover, and began what might be described as the first corporate meeting of the post-Alexander era. Only with more shouting and fewer minutes taken. Perdiccas, one of Alexander's trusted commanders, claimed that the king had handed him the royal signet ring before dying. That, of course, meant that Perdiccas should rule as regent until the unborn child could take the throne. Everyone nodded politely, and then immediately began plotting to kill him. But the real prize wasn't the title, it was the body. Alexander's embalmed remains were to be sent back to Macedonia for burial in the royal tombs at Aegae, or perhaps Amphipolis. That would have been the dignified, traditional thing to do. Unfortunately, dignity rarely survives contact with politics. Perdiccas ordered a magnificent golden hearse to be built. And when I say magnificent, I mean absurdly, eye-wateringly over the top. It took 2 years to complete, a massive, wheeled chariot covered in gilded panels and decorated with jeweled reliefs. It had miniature columns, winged figures, and a canopy that glittered like sunlight on water. It was not a vehicle, it was a moving cathedral. When the hearse finally rolled out of Babylon, it was accompanied by soldiers, musicians, and elephants. Because, of course, elephants. This was Alexander's funeral, no expense spared, no understatement allowed. The plan was to march the body north, through Syria, to Macedonia. But the route conveniently passed through Egypt. And that's where the trouble began. You see, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's old drinking buddies, now the governor of Egypt, had his own ideas. He wasn't interested in waiting around for royal decrees or regents. He wanted Alexander's body for himself. And, in true Macedonian fashion, he simply took it. Somewhere near Damascus, Ptolemy intercepted the procession. Imagine it, a column of soldiers and mourners trudging through the desert, the glittering hearse creaking along behind them, when suddenly, Egyptian troops appear on the horizon. There's a brief standoff, a few tense words exchanged, and then, well, let's say diplomacy gave way to logistics. Ptolemy seized the hearse and redirected it toward Memphis, Egypt. He claimed it was to honor Alexander properly, to protect the body from political chaos. But really, he wanted the prestige of being the guardian of a god. In Egypt, divine status was not a metaphor, it was a career path. And so, the body of Alexander, once king of Macedon and conqueror of Persia, was quietly stolen and taken down the Nile. It was interred first at Memphis, then later moved to a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, the city he'd founded and named after himself, because of course he had. There, his gilded sarcophagus became an object of pilgrimage. Generals, philosophers, and even Roman emperors came to gaze upon the preserved face of the man who had tried to unite the world. Julius Caesar visited it. So did Augustus, who, according to one source, accidentally broke the corpse's nose while touching it. A clumsy emperor, a cracked demigod. It's an oddly fitting image for the end of the ancient world's greatest ego trip. Meanwhile, the empire Alexander left behind was dissolving beautifully. The generals, known as the Diadochi, spent the next few decades tearing it apart in what historians politely call the Wars of the Successors. They carved up the territories like children dividing a birthday cake that no one baked. Each one claimed to be the rightful heir to Alexander's glory. And each one, inevitably, turned on the others. Perdiccas, the self-proclaimed regent, didn't last long. He was killed by his own soldiers during a botched invasion of Egypt, ironically, while trying to recover Alexander's body. Ptolemy held onto it. And with it, he built a dynasty. His descendants, the Ptolemies, would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The last of them, of course, was Cleopatra, who also claimed to be descended from Alexander's divine line. History, as usual, is just people recycling the same myth with better eyeliner. As the wars dragged on, the memory of the original Brotherhood faded. The camaraderie of the companions, their oaths, their shared battles, their drunken feasts, became legend. In their place rose new kings, each pretending to be Alexander reborn. None of them quite managed it. How could they? The world only tolerates one man who names 20 cities after himself before it starts getting suspicious. And through it all, the body of Alexander lay in its golden tomb, silent witness to the chaos he had unleashed. For centuries, travelers wrote about seeing it, glittering beneath glass, embalmed in honey and myth. Then, sometime in late antiquity, the tomb vanished. No one knows exactly when or where. It was likely destroyed, looted, or buried under the shifting sands of Alexandria. The body of the god king simply disappeared. There's something poetic in that. A man who had wanted to conquer the world ends up lost to it. A figure who wanted eternal glory drifts quietly into anonymity. No grave. No monument. Just the faint scent of incense and the echo of a name. So, as we drift toward the end of this strange Macedonian story, let's remember how it began. With a feast, a friendship, and a belief that brotherhood could transcend death. And how it ended. With a gilded hearse in the desert, and an empire devouring itself around an empty throne. The torches are out now. The wine has gone flat. The gods have fallen asleep. And Alexander, somewhere, perhaps, finally has too. Let's drift away now. Into the quiet, where empires fade, and only stories remain. Hey everyone. If you're still here, still awake, or perhaps pleasantly halfway to dreaming, welcome back. Tonight, we're not marching with Macedonian soldiers or clinking golden cups in Babylon. We're drifting down the Nile, under the soft hum of insects and the silver light of a desert moon. And somewhere, beneath the sands and the marble and the centuries, Alexander the Great is still sleeping. But his shadow is very much awake. When Ptolemy I stole Alexander's body and set it in Memphis, he didn't just take a corpse, he took a symbol. A symbol of divine legitimacy, of empire, of eternal rule. And Egypt, as it happened, had a long history of treating kings as gods. It was a perfect fit. Greek ambition met Egyptian mysticism, and together, they produced something strange, glittering, and quietly doomed, the Ptolemaic dynasty. You can think of the Ptolemies as the after-party of Alexander's empire. A very long after-party. Everyone is slightly inbred, overdressed, and pretending the music hasn't stopped. They were Macedonian by blood, Greek by culture, and Egyptian by convenience. In public, they wore the crowns of the pharaohs, offered sacrifices to Isis, and claimed divine descent from the old gods. In private, they spoke Greek, read Homer, and complained about the humidity. It was a family built on contradictions, half in love with the past, half obsessed with power. And over the generations, they did what royal families often do when left alone for too long. They turned inward. They began to marry their siblings. At first, it was symbolic, an imitation of the divine marriages of Egyptian mythology. But as time went on, it became painfully literal. By the time we reach Cleopatra 7, the Cleopatra, the family tree looks less like a tree and more like a particularly distressed vine. Cleopatra herself, though, was remarkably sharp. Fluent in several languages, cunning, charismatic, and fully aware that she was living in the twilight of a dynasty. She inherited not just a throne, but centuries of inherited instability in very questionable genetics. And above it all, hovering like a ghost, was Alexander. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, his city. They kept his tomb there, a centerpiece of their royal image. It was a reminder to every visitor, every ambassador, every rival, that they were heirs to the man who had conquered the known world. Even when the empire had shrunk to a strip of Nile and coastline, they clung to that idea. Because if they were still Alexander's children, they must still matter. Cleopatra, especially, leaned into that lineage. She styled herself as the new Isis, the living goddess, and, quietly, as the spiritual daughter of Alexander. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, she reportedly took him to see Alexander's tomb, the great golden sarcophagus shimmering beneath its glass cover. It must have been an unnerving sight. The conqueror of the ancient world, perfectly preserved, lying just a few feet away from the woman trying to seduce the conqueror of the new one. According to Roman accounts, Caesar was deeply moved. He wept. He placed a golden crown on Alexander's head and a cloak on his body. And for a moment, standing between the past and the present, he must have seen himself reflected in that corpse, the same hunger for glory, the same certainty that history would never forget him. It rarely does, of course. But history also has a short attention span. A generation later, Augustus visited the tomb as well. He too wanted to see the face of the man who had once ruled the world. He reportedly touched Alexander's nose, and broke it. A small, clumsy accident, perhaps. Or maybe a metaphor so perfect it doesn't need embellishment, the Romans literally disfiguring the legacy they'd come to worship. After that, the tomb begins to vanish from history's record. By the 2nd century CE, travelers still mentioned it. By the 4th, it was gone. Maybe destroyed in riots. Maybe buried by earthquakes. Maybe simply forgotten, like so many of the world's grandest things. But Cleopatra carried its ghost with her until the very end. Her dynasty had started with Alexander's body, and it would end with hers. She, too, would become an object of obsession, half goddess, half myth, forever entangled with Rome's rise and Egypt's fall. When Octavian marched into her palace after her death, he likely stood in rooms once lined with portraits of Alexander. It's tempting to imagine him pausing there, surrounded by fading gold, wondering if all conquerors end up in the same quiet way, trapped between glory and ruin, embalmed in their own legend. Because, in a way, Cleopatra and Alexander weren't so different. Both were dreamers who built their power out of spectacle. Both used divinity as a weapon. And both believed they could bend the world into the shape they wanted. But time, as always, had other ideas. The ghost of Alexander lingered long after the tomb was lost. His name became shorthand for greatness, even when few remembered the details. Every conqueror since has, at some point, been compared to him, usually unfavorably. Napoleon, Caesar, even modern generals, each one haunted by that same impossible standard. It's the kind of legacy that traps people. Because once you call someone great, you condemn everyone else to disappointment. So here we are. The torches of Babylon have burned out. The marble of Alexandria has crumbled. And yet, the story hums softly on, like a song played on ancient strings. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the whisper of a Macedonian accent, a laugh echoing over the clink of bronze cups. Somewhere, Alexander and Hephaestion are still toasting eternity, still convinced that the world belongs to them. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. Because for all the empires that have come and gone, for all the kings and conquerors buried in gold and dust, we're still talking about them. Still tracing their shadows on the walls of history. Still falling asleep to the sound of their stories. And that, in its quiet way, is a kind of immortality. So let's drift away now. The Nile runs silent. The desert sighs. The ghosts of empires sleep beneath the sand. And somewhere, far beyond time and marble and memory, Alexander is still dreaming of the world. Hey everyone. If you're still with me, you've walked a long way tonight. From the dusty roads of Macedon to the marble halls of Babylon. From the torchlit feasts of Alexander's companions to the soft, golden silence of Cleopatra's Egypt. It's been a journey through ambition, through grief, and through the strange, flickering light of immortality. But before we drift off completely, let's linger for a while in the quiet. Let's talk about what happened after Alexander, not to his body or his empire, but to his idea. Because Alexander didn't just conquer land. He conquered imagination. And that, as it turns out, lasts much longer. In the centuries after his death, his story became less about a man and more about a myth. Greek writers turned him into the perfect hero. Persian ones made him a divine instrument of fate. And when the story reached the medieval world, Alexander became something else entirely, a half-legendary figure who tamed monsters, found the edge of the earth, and even glimpsed the gates of paradise. The Alexander romance, as it came to be called, was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. Each culture reshaped him in its own image. In Christian tales, he became a seeker of God. In Arabic texts, he was Iskandar Tulkarnain, the two-horned one, a warrior blessed by heaven. In Persian poems, he wandered the world searching for wisdom. And everywhere, he remained the same, restless, beautiful, impossible. It's strange how the world keeps rewriting him. Maybe because we need him to mean something. To be proof that greatness can exist, even if it always comes with a cost. But of course, the cost is the point. Every empire that tried to follow Alexander's dream learned the same quiet lesson, that unity is an illusion, and conquest is only a way of postponing chaos. The Romans learned it. So did the Ottomans. And the British, and the French, and all the rest. Each one called themselves heirs to Alexander. Each one ended the same way. In dust, paperwork, and regret. The myth of eternal empire never truly dies, it just changes uniforms. And maybe that's because the people who build empires rarely understand what they're building. They see maps, borders, and marble. They don't see the slow exhaustion, the centuries of inheritance and infighting, the delicate web of humanity underneath it all. Alexander didn't either. He wanted the world. He got it. And it nearly killed him before he reached 33. When you strip away the glory, what's left is a young man who believed his destiny was divine. A man who outlived his friends, outdrank his grief, and died surrounded by silence. And yet, his dream lingers. Not because it was wise, but because it was beautiful. And sometimes beauty, even tragic beauty, refuses to fade. In a way, we all live in the shadow of Alexander's imagination. The very idea that there is a known world, a single globe that can be measured, conquered, or mapped. That's his legacy. Before him, there were kingdoms. After him, there were empires. The idea of blending East and West, of merging cultures instead of simply crushing them. That too was his invention, or at least his attempt. It failed, of course. But in the long quiet between history's collapses, people kept trying. Because even a broken ideal can still give shape to dreams. When we think of Alexander now, we don't think of Babylon, or Egypt, or the bones scattered across his battlefields. We think of motion, of yearning, of a man who kept moving forward, even when there was nowhere left to go. It's a story that hums softly under so many others, the explorers, the conquerors, the visionaries, the fools. All of them chasing something shining just beyond reach. And maybe that's what makes it such a good bedtime story. Because it isn't really about war or power. It's about longing. A longing so deep it outlasted the man who felt it. If you listen to the wind in the deserts of Iraq, they say you can still hear it. The faint echo of hoofbeats, the distant laughter of soldiers drunk on victory and illusion. If you walk through the ruins of Alexandria, beneath the sand and stone, you're standing on his dream. It's buried, yes, but not gone. Dreams like that never really go away. And if you close your eyes tonight, maybe you'll see him. The young king with the restless eyes. The lion-hearted boy who thought he could touch the stars. The conqueror who never found peace. And the friend who couldn't let go of love. He'll lift his cup, as he always does, to absent gods and fallen brothers. And the music will start again. A quiet song, older than empire, drifting through the smoke of another ancient feast. You'll hear the sound of laughter, the clink of bronze cups, and then the soft rustle of silence, as the world falls asleep once more beneath the weight of its own stories. So take a breath. The torches are out. The sands are cool. The river moves slowly under the moon. The ghosts of kings have had their say. And you've listened long enough to become part of the story too. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars Alexander once chased. And dream, as he did, of a world that never ends. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're slipping quietly into the Middle Ages. The world has grown dimmer now, colder, rougher, and full of candlelight and whispers. The libraries of Alexandria are long gone, and the streets of Europe echo with the shuffle of monks and merchants. And somewhere in the corners of these stone cities, cats still live, though not quite as adored as they once were. You might remember how cats began as little desert partners, half pet, half predator, in the fields of the Fertile Crescent. They followed humans home, learned our habits, and discovered the cozy bliss of grain storage. But the Middle Ages were not kind to them. Let's drift back there. In a Camlelid abbey in northern France, a monk writes by hand, the scratching of his quill almost blending with the soft purring beside him. A small gray cat curls at his feet, pretending indifference but keeping one wary eye on the mouse hole by the pantry door. For a time, monasteries loved cats. They were useful, quiet, and tidy, qualities that made them far more agreeable than the average pilgrim. Monks even gave them names, though rarely flattering ones. Pangurban, the white cat of the Irish monk who wrote a poem about his feline friend in the 9th century. The poem is soft, almost tender, the monk comparing his search for divine truth to the cat's patient hunt for mice. It's one of the oldest love letters to a cat in Western literature. But love stories rarely last long in medieval Europe. By the 13th century, superstition began to creep in like a shadow under the door. Cats, especially black ones, became tangled up in something darker, witchcraft. People started to whisper that cats were the familiars of witches, agents of the devil, or even witches themselves in disguise. Because of course they did. The Middle Ages could turn anything mysterious into a moral threat. And cats, with their reflective eyes, silent steps, and maddening independence, fit the part perfectly. In France, they called them chats de sorcières. In Germany, Hexenkatzen. Even in England, cats were blamed when milk soured, when bread failed to rise, when babies cried in the night. It didn't help that cats, being practical creatures, had little interest in pleasing anyone. They refused to obey, refused to beg, and stared straight through people as if already communing with something unseen. And humans, being humans, took offense. During witch trials, confessions were often encouraged, that is, tortured, out of accused women. And many of those women claimed their familiar spirit appeared as a cat. Sometimes it was said to be black, sometimes gray, sometimes a sleek, shadowy blur that slipped through doors at night. It's all very poetic in hindsight, but to them, it was evidence. And so, countless cats were burned, drowned, or otherwise disposed of, especially in Western Europe. There's a sad irony to it all. By killing cats, people indirectly made their own lives harder. Because when the cats were gone, the rats returned. And when rats multiplied, disease followed. Some historians, cautiously, note that this may have made the Black Death even worse. Not because cats could have prevented it entirely, but because their absence allowed rodent populations to surge unchecked. So in a roundabout way, superstition may have cost millions of lives. A grim result for simply not liking a creature that blinked too slowly. Yet not everywhere shared the same madness. In the Islamic world, cats remained respected, even cherished. There's a famous story about the Prophet Muhammad cutting off his robe sleeve rather than disturb his sleeping cat, Muetza. Whether true or not, it says something about the difference in attitude. In those lands, cats wandered freely through marketplaces and mosques, their presence considered clean, even blessed. Meanwhile, in Europe, the very same animal could be considered unholy, a vessel of evil, depending on which street it wandered down. The contrast is almost comical, in that quiet, weary historical way. Still, not all was bleak. In port towns, cats found redemption. Sailors discovered that cats were excellent crew members. They caught rats, didn't complain, and often seemed to sense bad weather before anyone else. So while churchmen muttered about devils, ship captains kept cats close. There's even a record of Henry VIII's ship Mary Rose carrying a cat aboard before it sank. And later, during the Age of Exploration, cats traveled with sailors to the New World, unknowingly beginning yet another chapter in human-feline cohabitation. Imagine that, the descendants of Egypt's temple cats now stalking mice in the hulls of Spanish galleons. The world had changed beyond recognition, but cats had adapted, as always. And in the quiet of medieval homes, despite fear and rumor, many people still secretly fed the strays. A widow might leave a bowl of milk by the door, whispering a prayer against bad luck. A child might stroke a black kitten and swear never to tell anyone. Because even in the darkest centuries, someone always remembered that cats were, at the end of the day, just cats. Silent, mysterious, sometimes aloof, but comforting in their own small, living way. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the flicker of torchlight against stone walls. A lone cat walking across a monastery floor, tail curling, eyes gleaming like tiny lamps. Outside, the world is full of rumors. But inside, for just a moment, it's peaceful, the scratch of a quill, the hum of a prayer, the soft purr of a creature that refused to be tamed entirely. Let's drift onward soon, to the Renaissance, when cats would make their slow return to grace, through art, science, and superstition of a different sort. But for now, let's just rest here, beside the sleeping cat in the candlelight. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're waking up, just a little, and finding ourselves in a gentler world. The air smells of oil paint and wood smoke. There are bells in the distance, and the sound of footsteps on cobblestones. Europe is stirring from the long medieval dream. The year might be 1450, or 1500, it doesn't really matter. Somewhere in Florence, a painter dips his brush into a tiny cup of ochre, turns toward the window, and squints at the shape of a cat asleep on the sill. And just like that, the cat begins to reclaim its dignity. The Renaissance loved to rediscover things that had been forgotten. Old books. Lost ideas. A sense that beauty wasn't a sin. And so, tucked between anatomy studies and angel wings, the cat reappeared, slipping quietly back into human imagination. Painters loved them, even when they pretended not to. Leonardo da Vinci sketched them endlessly, twisting, leaping, grooming themselves, yawning mid-pounce. There's an entire page of his notebooks filled only with cats. No angels. No men of science. Just cats. He drew them the way one sketches a puzzle that refuses to be solved. And of course he would. Cats are living contradictions, lazy and feral, elegant and ridiculous, affectionate only when it suits them. The Renaissance adored that sort of paradox. In domestic scenes, Madonnas, mostly, you start to see cats again. They sit at Mary's feet, batting at the baby Jesus toys, or staring suspiciously at angels. Sometimes they symbolize domestic warmth. Sometimes sin. But either way, they're there. The painters couldn't resist including them. There's one painting by Federico Barocci, from the late 1500s, where a small tabby curls up beside the Virgin's blue robe. It's so natural that it feels accidental, as if the painter simply couldn't imagine a home without a cat underfoot. And maybe that was the point. By now, cats were home again. Meanwhile, in cities like Venice or Antwerp, cats ruled the workshops. Printers loved them for practical reasons. They kept mice from chewing the parchment. But there was a certain irony there too. These were the same printing houses that produced new translations of the Bible, the same text that had once condemned cats by association. History has a sense of humor like that. Let's drift over to the scientists. They, too, began to look at cats with a new kind of fascination. Anatomists studied their musculature, noting the perfection of motion, the precision of the spine. One even remarked that the cat was a model of divine mechanics. That's quite an upgrade from Agent of Satan. And yet, the cat itself never changed. It didn't become more loyal or obedient or rational. It was simply the same creature it had always been, watchful, detached, self-assured. It was people who changed around it. We decided that independence could be charming. We rebranded mystery as grace. We learned to admire what we once feared. But not everyone forgave so easily. In rural villages, superstition still clung on like ivy on stone. Black cats were still avoided, especially by travelers at night. There were still whispers, though softer now, echoes of the old medieval fear. Yet, in cities, things were different. Cats belonged to apothecaries, seamstresses, booksellers. In Paris, one 16th century doctor was said to diagnose illnesses by watching how his cat reacted to the patient. He was usually wrong, but people adored the idea. And of course, there were artists, those strange, sleepless people who saw a cat and thought, yes, that's the soul of this entire age. In Florence, a sculptor named Cellini once kept a pet cat in his workshop. It would sit beside his furnace, half asleep, while molten bronze was poured into molds. He claimed it was the only creature that didn't flinch at the heat. He called it Il Coraggioso, the brave one. In Venice, another painter, Titian, had a studio full of models, assistants, and cats. The cats were not officially on payroll, but they certainly acted like they were. One apprentice complained in a letter that the master's cat guarded the pigments more fiercely than the saints guarded heaven. It's a wonderful image. A young artist, terrified of spilling vermilion, and a cat glaring at him with immoral disdain. And so, the cat quietly climbed its way back into favor, without effort, without apology. By the time the 17th century arrived, cats were everywhere again, on windowsills, in still life paintings, in family portraits. They symbolized comfort, wit, even sensuality. A long way from the stake, you might say. But that's the curious thing about history. It loops. It forgets. It forgives, but never quite fully. Even as cats reappeared in art, they still carried a shadow of mystery. They were loved, yes, but also respected, as if everyone remembered, deep down, that this animal had once been something divine. As the Renaissance ended, cats spread with trade and empire. They sailed with merchants to every corner of the world, Asia, Africa, the Americas. They settled into taverns and palaces alike. Some became local legends. In Japan, for instance, sailors brought cats aboard to catch rats. But in time, those cats became symbols of good fortune, the ancestors of the Moneki Nico, the beckoning cat statue you still see today. Back in Europe, cats prowled the cobbled streets of London and Lisbon. They were survivors, as they had always been. They had outlived empires, religions, and revolutions of taste. And now, at last, they were simply part of us. So as you drift off tonight, imagine a small Renaissance studio, its window cracked open to the night air. A candle flickers beside a half-finished canvas. The painter is asleep in his chair. And on the table, curled around a palette of colors, a cat purrs softly in its dreams. It doesn't care for theology, or symbolism, or human redemption. It's just warm, content, and entirely itself. Maybe that's the lesson. That the cat never needed to be domesticated twice. We were the ones who needed to relearn how to live beside it. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're gliding softly into the age of powdered wigs, candlelit salons, and delicate porcelain teacups. It's the 18th century now. The world smells faintly of ink, coffee, and philosophy. Men in silk coats are arguing about liberty. Women in towering hairstyles are hosting conversations that could topple kingdoms. And somewhere, beneath all that chatter, a cat yawns. Because while humans were reinventing government, science, and reason, cats were reinventing leisure. The Enlightenment adored order, symmetry, and logic. Cats adored none of those things. They were mysterious in a century that worshipped clarity. They were free in an age obsessed with control. And perhaps that's why they became so quietly beloved. In France, particularly, cats made themselves at home in salons, those elegant, slightly smoky rooms where philosophers, poets, and the mildly insufferable gathered to exchange ideas. It's said that Voltaire's cat, Brillante, often curled up on his manuscripts, forcing him to pause his writing and reflect. Diderot, who helped compile the encyclopedia, reportedly once spent an entire afternoon describing the mathematical perfection of a cat's stretch. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who distrusted almost everyone, wrote that he preferred the company of cats to that of most men. Hard to argue with that. Cats fit the new social mood perfectly. They were intelligent but not servile. Elegant but not ostentatious. You didn't own a cat, you coexisted with it. And in a century that was quietly questioning the nature of power, that idea of partnership rather than domination felt revolutionary in its own small way. Of course, there were still dog people. But cats were the animal of choice for the introspective, the witty, the slightly melancholic. If a man in a salon quoted Latin and had a cat on his lap, everyone just assumed he had thoughts too complex to share aloud. In England, things were a little different, but not by much. Cats crept into parlors and printing houses, chasing away mice while writers and publishers argued about censorship. Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer, adored his cat, Hotch. He spoiled him shamelessly, feeding him oysters and buying his food himself so the servants wouldn't think less of the animal. When Johnson's friend Boswell mocked the idea of loving a cat so much, Johnson simply said, "Sir, he is a very fine cat indeed." That's the Enlightenment in miniature. The belief that one could adore reason, progress, and knowledge, and still make room for tenderness. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms of Paris, cats became miniature symbols of refinement. They lounged on embroidered cushions, were painted into portraits beside duchesses, and appeared in porcelain figurines, eternally mid-purr. Artists used them to soften the austerity of noble faces. A countess might look haughty until you noticed the small tabby paw resting on her lap. Even the philosopher Montesquieu once mused that a cat is nature's way of teaching independence to the soul. The irony, of course, is that many of these same nobles would soon lose their heads. But the cats, unsurprisingly, survived the French Revolution quite well. Revolutionary France was a terrifying, exhilarating mess. Yet in the chaos of the streets, cats endured, darting between barricades, curling in the windows of cafes, slipping through the cracked doors of libraries. They had no politics, but everyone claimed them. Aristocrats saw them as emblems of elegance, Republicans admired their independence. And somewhere in the midst of it all, a few pamphleteers compared them to the ideals of liberty itself. A creature that obeys no master but lives content among men, that, they said, was the perfect citizen. It's a bit of a stretch, of course. But it's the kind of philosophical stretch you can only make at 2 in the morning, surrounded by books and candle smoke, which is exactly when the Enlightenment liked to work. By the late 18th century, cats had gone global again. Traders, colonists, and travelers took them everywhere, to the Americas, to India, to the islands of the Pacific. Wherever humans went, cats followed, and wherever cats went, they made themselves indispensable. On ships, they were still pest control. In colonial homes, they were comfort. And in the growing middle-class households of Europe, they were the new family member, one that didn't bark, didn't demand, and didn't care what you thought about Rousseau. And then came the writers. Every great intellectual movement eventually produces its pet lovers. For the Enlightenment, it was poets and essayists. Horace Walpole described his cat, Selma, in tragic terms after she drowned in a bowl of goldfish, a story that inspired Thomas Gray's famous poem Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat. It's a melodramatic little piece about vanity and fate, because, naturally, everything in the 1700s had to be a moral lesson. Still, it's oddly sweet. Even as philosophers debated God and government, they paused to mourn a drowned cat. That's progress, in its own sleepy, sentimental way. So, by the time the Enlightenment dimmed into the 19th century, cats were no longer demons, or symbols, or curiosities. They were household constants. The age of superstition was over. And for the first time, in the heart of reason itself, cats were just loved. You could find them asleep in Parisian garrets, beside writers hunched over manuscripts. You could find them in London parlors, warming themselves by the fire. You could even find them in the New World, curled up in rocking chairs beside settlers who had crossed oceans, bringing this tiny piece of comfort along. So as we drift to sleep tonight, imagine a candle flickering in a Paris salon. A man in a powdered wig has fallen asleep mid-sentence, quill still in hand. On his notes, a cat lies stretched out, perfectly content, its tail twitching in dreams. Outside, revolutions are beginning. Inside, reason is being invented. But the cat is eternal. It doesn't argue, it doesn't scheme, it doesn't care. It simply exists, soft, patient, utterly self-possessed. A small philosopher in fur. And maybe that's what the Enlightenment really needed all along. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're opening a heavy velvet curtain and stepping into the 19th century. The air smells of coal smoke, soap, and lavender polish. There's lace on every surface, and somewhere, a clock is ticking far too loudly. This is the world of the Victorians, a world that loved order, manners, and moral virtue almost as much as it loved making life complicated. And into this tightly buttoned universe wandered a creature that refused to follow rules, the cat. The Victorians adored pets. For the first time in European history, animals weren't just workers, hunters, or symbols. They were companions. Family. And the cat, that old wanderer of temples and alleys, was about to become a national obsession. Part of it was sentimentality. The Industrial Revolution had turned life noisy and grimy, and people wanted a touch of softness at home. Cats were clean, quiet, and didn't need walking through the soot. But part of it was something else, a growing fascination with classification. The Victorians catalogued everything: plants, fossils, emotions, sins. And, naturally, cats. It began with the rise of the cat fancy. Yes, that's the real term. In 1871, the first organized cat show was held at London's Crystal Palace. It featured 170 cats, each displayed in neat cages like exotic treasures: Persians, Angoras, tabbies, even working-class mousers from the docks. Queen Victoria herself owned a pair of blue Persians, which immediately made them fashionable. Because if the Queen had a cat, then everyone had to have one. Suddenly, cats were no longer anonymous creatures slipping through the night. They had names, pedigrees, and reputations. People began breeding them, writing about them, even drawing up rules for what constituted a perfect feline. It was all very serious, in that endearingly overcomplicated Victorian way. Writers, naturally, couldn't resist. Charles Dickens, that master of sentimental detail, once described a cat as a wonderful creature that combines dignity and affection, and looks down upon mankind as if we were here to serve it. He was not wrong. Meanwhile, artists like Louis Wayne gave the era its most famous cat faces, wide-eyed, eccentric, half-human expressions that became beloved illustrations in books and magazines. Wayne's cats played poker, rode bicycles, drank tea, and wore monocles. They were absurd, charming, and slightly unsettling, much like the Victorians themselves. But beneath all the lace and laughter, there was a strange duality. The Victorians both adored cats and moralized about them. Some saw them as emblems of domestic virtue, graceful, gentle, motherly. Others warned that their independence bordered on sin. In Victorian moral literature, cats were sometimes portrayed as feminine archetypes, mysterious, elegant, and slightly dangerous. Dogs represented loyalty, cats represented beauty and pride. So, of course, cats became the animal of poets, painters, and unmarried women, the creative souls who didn't quite fit the mold. There was even a whisper of scandal in it. A woman who preferred cats to society was a little too free-spirited for comfort. Yet, despite the judgment, cats flourished. In every respectable home, they appeared, curled on embroidered cushions, lounging beside gas lamps, pretending not to notice the chaos of industrial life. Even the most rigid gentleman would, in private, sneak a saucer of milk to the family cat. And while cities grew noisier and more mechanical, cats retained their ancient calm. They became, in a way, the guardians of tranquility, tiny remnants of nature that purred against the hum of progress. There's something particularly soothing about imagining a Victorian night. Outside, carriages clatter on cobblestones. Inside, the fire glows, the parlor clock ticks, and a cat lies stretched across a pile of papers on the writing desk. The writer sighs, too tired to move the animal, and simply writes around it. Somewhere in the margins of history, entire novels were probably composed around sleeping cats. And that feels exactly right. Even science began to take an interest. Charles Darwin, always curious about the small details of creation, once observed that every cat had its own temperament, some wild, some tender, some almost dog-like in affection. He found that intriguing. It didn't fit into neat evolutionary categories. Which, of course, delighted him. Because even Darwin knew that cats obeyed evolution in the same way they obeyed humans, selectively. By the late 19th century, cats were truly global celebrities. Newspapers featured feline heroes who saved babies from house fires or caught record numbers of rats. There were stories of ship's cats crossing oceans and returning home by instinct. And, inevitably, there were royal cats, pampered, perfumed, occasionally painted. The British even sent cats to their colonies as official mousers, because nothing says empire like exporting a carnivore for administrative efficiency. But the most telling change wasn't in fame, it was in affection. For the first time, people began mourning their cats publicly. Gravestones appeared in pet cemeteries. Tiny inscriptions read things like, "My dear Fluffy, faithful friend." Once burned as witches' familiars, cats now had epitaphs. That's quite an evolution. And so, the Victorian era ended with cats firmly enthroned in the human heart. They had outlasted the plagues, the popes, and the philosophers. They had stared down centuries of misunderstanding and come out purring. They were no longer servants or symbols. They were family. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine a quiet Victorian study. The gaslight hisses softly. Outside, fog wraps around the lampposts. And inside, a cat sits upon a pile of letters, eyes half closed, tail wrapped around its paws. It doesn't care about progress or propriety. It just knows it has won. Because after 5,000 years of patient coexistence, the cat has finally done what no conqueror or king ever managed. It made humans serve it, and love doing so. Hey everyone. Tonight, let's drift forward, slowly, out of the candlelit parlor and into the flicker of electric light. The streets hum now, not with hooves and carriages, but with engines. And somewhere, above it all, a cat is sitting on a warm car hood, blinking at the neon. We've arrived in the modern age. And somehow, against every odd, the cat has remained exactly the same. It's funny, really. Every other creature that joined us in civilization was shaped and reshaped by our needs. Dogs became hunters, guards, helpers. Cattle became obedient and slow. Even pigeons, those accidental city dwellers, became our reluctant mailmen. But the cat? It changed almost nothing. It still hunts when it wants, sleeps where it pleases, and comes to you not when you call, but when it's convenient. That's not evolution. That's strategy. In the early 20th century, cats quietly followed us into our new, electric world. They sat beside wireless radios and slept on typewriters. They adapted perfectly to apartments, those small, box-like homes that made dogs restless. A cat could live happily in 3 rooms, as long as there was a window and a sunny spot to occupy. It was the perfect pet for the new century's pace. Independent, elegant, low maintenance, an introvert's companion. By the 1930s and 40s, the cat had gone from domestic ornament to domestic partner. During World War II, cats were cherished in homes and on ships, believed to bring luck and protect rations from vermin. Naval logbooks mention them by name: Simon, Convoy, Oscar. Small, furry morale officers amid the chaos. One famous cat, Simon of HMS Amethyst, even received the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, for bravery at sea. He survived shellfire, caught rats, and comforted wounded sailors. And when he died, they gave him a full military burial. For a species that once lived in temple granaries, that's quite a promotion. After the war, everything changed, except the cat's personality. Television arrived. Advertising. Glossy magazines. And cats, being naturally photogenic and unervingly graceful, became icons. There were Felix the Cat cartoons in the 1920s, later reborn in print and on screens. There was Tom and Jerry, of course, turning the ancient rivalry of hunter and prey into slapstick legend. And later, Garfield, who somehow managed to represent the cat soul perfectly, lazy, smug, food-driven, and quietly aware of his superiority. We laughed, but we understood. Because we all know that look, the one that says, "I could destroy you, but I won't." Not tonight. Science, too, began to take an interest in these quiet house gods. Biologists studied their senses, their communication, their strange half-wild instincts. We discovered that a cat's purr isn't just cute, it may actually promote healing, in them and in us. Their purring frequency, somewhere between 25 and 150 Hz, stimulates tissue regeneration and lowers stress. So yes, when your cat lies on your chest, it might literally be repairing you. A small, furry therapist, paid entirely in kibble and indifference. Of course, cats weren't immune to modern superstition either. By the 1960s, black cats had shifted from omens of death to symbols of Halloween kitsch. And by the 1980s, the crazy cat lady stereotype took hold, another gentle insult directed mostly at women who preferred their pets to polite society. But the cats themselves didn't care. They never do. They've outlasted gods, kings, and social stigma. They were perfectly content to let us make jokes while they continued their quiet conquest. Then came the internet. And if you want proof that cats run the world, look no further than the web. From the earliest dial-up forums to YouTube's dawn, cats have dominated digital culture. The first viral videos? Cats. The first memes? Cats. The first emotional support live stream during a global pandemic? Also cats. There's something universal in their absurdity, those wide eyes, sudden leaps, dignified stumbles. A cat can fall off a shelf with the solemnity of a Shakespearean actor. And somehow, that makes us feel calmer. Somewhere around 2010, a gray tabby with a perpetually unimpressed face became the face of the internet, Grumpy Cat. Her real name was Tartar Sauce, but no one called her that. She was the perfect meme for a world that had grown tired and ironic. And she was loved fiercely. Millions followed her. She went on tour. She had an agent. She had merchandise, appearances, interviews. And through it all, she did absolutely nothing. She just existed. Which, for a cat, is the ultimate victory. Today, there are cats with more followers than some small nations. There are virtual cats, AI cats, pixel cats that earn cryptocurrency. There are rescue cats with GoPro cameras, and ancient cats mummified in museum live streams. It's as though the entire species has found its natural habitat, inside our collective attention span. We document them obsessively, like modern scribes chronicling minor deities. They blink, stretch, nap, and we call it content. And we feel strangely soothed. Because deep down, cats remind us of something ancient. They are the quiet constant in our restless story. They watched us build empires, invent machines, and lose sleep over stock markets. And they never changed. They still hunt in dreams, curl in sunlight, and purr when the world slows down. Maybe that's why we love them so much. Because in a world that spins too fast, cats move on their own time. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine one last scene. A small apartment window. The hum of the city below. And on the windowsill, a cat sits, its tail flicking slowly, eyes reflecting the streetlights. It isn't thinking about fame, or science, or social media. It's simply existing, perfectly at ease in the present moment. And maybe that's the lesson the cat has been teaching us for 5,000 years. To rest. To watch. To breathe. To be.